standing in the driveway of the house my son-in-law had begged me to help finance, the one I'd put $40,000 towards so my daughter wouldn't have to stress about a down payment, when my daughter opened the front door just wide enough to look at me the way you look at someone selling something you didn't ask for. Mom, we're kind of in the middle of something. Behind her, I could hear music and laughter and what sounded like a blender running. I had driven 40 minutes. I brought a casserole in a dish I'd had since before she was born. It was her birthday. I stood there for a moment holding that dish in both hands, and I said, I just wanted to drop this off. She took the dish without stepping aside. The door closed, not slammed. That would have been easier, actually. It just closed softly and completely, like I was a stranger who'd come to the wrong address. I sat in my car for a while before I started it. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a woman who complains. I am not a woman who asks for much, and I never have been. I taught school for 31 years in Knoxville, Tennessee, 6th grade English. I know what it means to give more than you receive, and still show up on Monday morning with a lesson plan. My husband passed 11 years ago, and I have been doing this life alone since then. My finances, my yard, my appointments, all of it. I am 67 years old, and I do not need to be rescued. What I needed for a long time was to believe that the people I loved most were going to be okay. That belief cost me a lot of money. My daughter is 41. Her name is Becca, and she is smart and funny, and she can be so warm when she wants to be. When she calls to tell me about something good that happened, or when she used to bring my granddaughter over on Sunday afternoons, and we'd make biscuits together and watch old movies. I held on to those Sundays for a long time. I think I was still holding on to them even as the requests started coming. Her husband, my son-in-law, I'll call him by what he is, a man who has not held the same job for more than 2 years in the entire time I've known him. He has a talent for explaining why none of that is his fault. He was charming when they met. He still is sometimes. Charm is easy when someone else is covering your overhead. The first time they asked me for help, my granddaughter was 3 years old, and they'd had an unexpected car repair. $1,100. I didn't hesitate. That's what you do. The second time was 6 months later, the water heater. The third time was the cell phone bill. I want to be careful here because I know some of you are already doing the math in your heads and thinking, well, why didn't she stop sooner? And I understand that question. I have asked it myself at 2 a.m, more times than I can count. The answer is that it didn't feel like a pattern for a long time. It felt like bad luck. It felt like family. It felt like the thing a mother is supposed to do when her child is struggling. And Becca was good at describing the struggle. She had a way of making every situation sound like it was almost resolved. Just one more month, just this one thing, just until his new position kicked in, just until the insurance came through. There was always a just. I kept thinking we were almost at the other side of something. We never were. I retired 3 years ago. I have a pension from the school district, and I have the savings I spent 30 years building, and I have the house I own outright, which I worked very hard not to touch. By most measures, I am comfortable. Not wealthy. Comfortable. When Becca and her husband started telling people I was set, I'd wince a little, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to seem ungrateful for what I had. But set became a kind of permission in their minds. I could see it shifting. The requests came more frequently. They got larger. And somewhere in there, without my ever agreeing to it, I had become a line item in their monthly budget. A few months after I retired, I started keeping a list. I don't know exactly what prompted me to start. Maybe it was a Sunday when I was trying to figure out why my own savings account looked thinner than I expected, or maybe it was just a feeling I'd been ignoring for too long that finally got loud enough to hear. I opened a notebook, the kind with the green cover I used to use for lesson plans, and I started writing things down. Mortgage gap payment, $600, car insurance, $287, electric bill, $214, groceries, 3 times, $340, prescription copays, $90, new tires, $480, rent, 1 month, $11,100, rent, a 1 month, 1111. That last one sat in my stomach like a stone. I had written it down without thinking too hard about it, and then I looked at it and I thought Scottsdale. They had asked me for that money the same week they told me they were behind on their electric bill. I remembered that now. I kept going through my bank statements, month by month, going back further than I thought I would need to. I wrote everything down. When I finished, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time looking at the list. 94 separate payments. Over 6 years, the total was just under $91,000. I read that number several times. I wanted to make sure I hadn't made an error. I went back through and checked each entry. I hadn't made an error. I want to tell you what that felt like, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. It wasn't quite grief, and it wasn't quite rage. It was something more like the sensation of finally understanding a story you'd been in the middle of for years, the nausea of clarity all at once, after a long time of choosing not to see clearly. I thought about the trip I had not taken. I had wanted to visit my sister in Portland for 2 Christmases running, and both times I'd decided I shouldn't spend the money. I thought about the roof repair I'd put off for 8 months, patching it myself with materials from the hardware store because I didn't want to dip into savings. I thought about the Sunday afternoons with my granddaughter, and how those had gotten rarer and rarer, and how often I'd been told she was busy or tired or at a friend's house. I thought about my daughter opening the front door of the house I helped buy, and looking at me like I'd come to the wrong address. I did not cry. I was a little surprised. I didn't. I just sat there with the green notebook and the number and the feeling of finally knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I didn't call Becca. I didn't say a word to anyone, not yet. I'm not a person who makes decisions when I'm sitting in the middle of a feeling. I know myself well enough to know I needed to let it settle. So I closed the notebook, made myself a cup of tea, and went to sit on the back porch, which is my favorite place in the world, the one thing in my life that has never asked anything of me. The azaleas were coming in. I watched them for a while. Then I started thinking about what I was actually going to do. That took some time. My first instinct, and I think this is most people's first instinct, was to confront, to sit down with Becca and lay out the notebook and say, look at this. Look at what you've done. Look at what I've given. I thought about that conversation a dozen different ways. In most versions of it, she cried, felt terrible, promised to do better. In some versions, she got defensive. In a few of them, my son-in-law said something I wouldn't be able to unhear. And I realized slowly that none of those versions changed anything that had already happened. The money was gone either way, and a confrontation would either drive her away or produce apologies that faded within a season. I'd seen that before. I'd been offered apologies before. What I wanted wasn't an apology. What I wanted was to stop. I wanted it to be over, not loudly, not with a fight, not with a list of grievances read aloud at a dinner table. I wanted to close the door the same way she had closed it on me, quietly, completely. So that's what I did. I didn't do it all at once. I was deliberate. Over the course of 3 weeks, I went through every recurring thing I was contributing to and I made a plan. The cell phones I was paying for, Becca's, her husband's, and their internet bill, which somehow had ended up on my account years ago. I set termination dates. The automatic transfers I'd set up temporarily, 18 months prior, canceled. The credit card I'd added her as a user on, removed. The standing arrangement where I covered her car insurance and she supposedly paid me back, which she hadn't done in over a year, ended. I wrote a letter to my financial advisor. I want to be intentional about my accounts going forward. I wrote. I want everything clean and separate and clearly mine. She helped me make sure there were no other loose ends I hadn't caught. I felt during those 3 weeks something I haven't felt in a long time. I felt like myself. I felt like the woman who managed a classroom of 30 11-year-olds, who bought her own house at 34, who drove herself to the hospital the night her husband had his first episode because she needed to be the steady one. I had gotten soft somewhere along the way. Not in my heart, I don't think, but in my boundaries. I had confused love with an open wallet. I had let the two things become so tangled that I'd stopped being able to see where one ended and the other began. They weren't the same thing. They had never been the same thing. I did not send Becca any message telling her what I'd done. The termination notices from the phone carrier went to her directly. The credit card change she would have noticed when it stopped working. The transfers simply stopped appearing in her account. I will tell you what happened next, because I know you want to know. About 9 days after the last of the changes had gone through, my phone rang. It was Becca. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message asking if everything was okay with my phone account, because something seemed to have changed. Her voice was careful. She wasn't angry yet. She didn't know yet. She called again 2 days later. This time her voice was different. "Mom, I need you to call me back." I called her back that evening. The conversation was not easy. I want to say that plainly. I had prepared myself for it, and it was still not easy. She asked what happened, and I told her I'd made some changes to my accounts, and going forward I needed to keep my finances separate. She asked what that meant. I said it meant what it sounded like it meant. There was a long pause. "Is this because of my birthday?" she said. And something in me went very still, because yes, in some ways the birthday was the moment the door had finally swung all the way open and I'd seen the room for what it was. But I knew what she was doing. She was looking for a small reason, a fixable reason, an apology-sized reason. If it was about the birthday, then she could apologize for the birthday, and we could go back to the way things were. "No," I said, "it isn't about one day." She was quiet. "I love you," I said. "That has not changed and it will not change. But I am 67 years old and I worked for a very long time to be comfortable, and I need to take care of myself now. I should have done this sooner." She didn't respond well that evening. I expected that. She brought up things I'd done imperfectly over the years, moments I wasn't there, decisions she disagreed with, old hurts that had apparently been sitting in a drawer waiting for an occasion. I listened. I had told myself I would listen, and I did. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I said, "I hear you," and I meant it. And when she ran out of things to say, I told her I loved her again, and we got off the phone. I sat on the back porch for a long time that night. It was cool enough to need a cardigan. The azaleas were done blooming by then. Those come and go quickly. But the yard was still pretty, still full of things I'd grown over years. I'd planted that dogwood the spring after my husband died. It was taller than the house now. I thought about who I'd been for the last 6 years. Not a bad person. Not a fool. Though it's hard not to use that word on yourself in moments like that. A woman who loved her daughter and was afraid of what it would mean to say no. Afraid that no would be interpreted as not caring. Afraid that pulling back would feel like pulling away. Afraid, if I'm honest, of being the kind of mother I'd always told myself I wouldn't be. But I'd turned myself inside out, trying to avoid one kind of failure and walk straight into another one. I had not helped my daughter build a life. I had helped her avoid building one. The weeks after that were strange. My son-in-law called once, only once, and left a voicemail that I'll be generous and describe as tense. I did not return it. There was no version of that conversation that would go well. I knew that. I had learned in 67 years which doors are worth opening and which ones you should let stay closed. My granddaughter texted me about a month later. She's 17, old enough to have her own phone that has nothing to do with my accounts. And she said, "Grandma, I heard some stuff and I just want to know if you're okay." I called her immediately. We talked for an hour. She told me she'd been missing our Sundays. I told her I'd been missing them too. I invited her to come over the following weekend, just the two of us, and she said yes. She came over. We made biscuits. We watched Moonstruck because I told her every woman should see it at least once, at any age. She laughed in all the right places. At some point, she reached over and put her head on my shoulder without saying anything, and I thought, this is the thing. Not the casseroles on the doorstep, not the transfers, not the $40,000 toward a down payment for a house where I was made to feel like a stranger. This. I heard through a mutual family friend, a few months later, that Becca and her husband had gone through a difficult stretch. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing when I heard that. I did feel something. I felt sad because she is my daughter and I don't want her life to be hard. But I also felt something else underneath the sadness, something steady and clear and quiet. The feeling of a person who is no longer responsible for a problem she didn't create. They worked through it, I was told. They are still together. Her husband picked up a new position, one that seems to be lasting longer than the others. I don't know the details. I don't need to. Becca and I are finding our way back to each other, slowly and carefully, the way you navigate a room after someone has moved the furniture around. It is not the same as it was. I don't think it will be, but I think it might be better in the way that honest things are better than comfortable fictions, even when they're harder to live with. Last month, she called me on a Tuesday evening, no particular reason, just to talk. We talked about her garden, which she started for the first time. She asked about my knee, which I'd mentioned was bothering me. She told me a story about her daughter, my granddaughter, that made us both laugh. She didn't ask me for anything. When I hung up, I stayed in my chair for a little while, thinking about that. 94 payments, almost a decade of choosing her comfort over my own clarity. And now a phone call on a Tuesday about tomatoes and knees, and a funny thing a teenager said. No transaction, no need. Just two people who love each other, figuring out what that actually looks like without money in the middle. I think that's worth more than 94 payments. I know it is. I know it in the way you know things after a long time of not letting yourself know them, slowly, and then completely, and then with a kind of peace that feels like coming home to a house you'd forgotten was yours. I've thought about the green notebook a lot since all of this happened. Not the number in it, though I still know that number by heart. But the act of opening it in the first place. That was the moment everything changed. Not the phone call with Becca. Not the day I canceled the last transfer. The moment I sat down and decided I was going to look clearly at something I had been choosing not to see for 6 years. That's the part nobody talks about, the choosing not to see. Because it isn't stupidity. It isn't weakness, exactly. It's something more like love gone sideways. Love that got so tangled up with guilt and fear and the need to be needed that it stopped being able to tell the difference between giving and disappearing. I had been disappearing for years, slowly, one payment at a time, and I had called it motherhood. What I know now is that real care, the kind that actually helps someone, has to be grounded in honesty first. Not the honesty of confrontation, not accusation, but the kind that starts inside yourself. The willingness to sit at your own kitchen table, open a notebook, and write down the truth, even when the truth is expensive. That took something from me. It took a kind of moral courage I hadn't needed to call on in a long time. I had to be willing to see my daughter clearly, not as the child I wanted her to be, not as the version of herself she presented when she needed something, but as a grown woman who had learned, partly because I let her, that there were no consequences for taking. And the intelligence part, because there is an intelligence to this, not just emotion, was understanding that a confrontation was not the same as a solution. I could have called Becca the night I finished that notebook. I could have read her every line. Part of me wanted to, but I knew it wouldn't change anything structurally. It would just move the pain around. What actually needed to happen was a change in the architecture, remove the thing that was enabling the pattern, quietly and completely, and let reality do the teaching I had failed to do by staying soft. That's what I did, and it worked. Not because I punished her. I didn't. It worked because the truth has a way of making itself known when you stop insulating people from it. Becca and her husband ran into the wall that had always been there. I had just been cushioning it for years with my pension and my savings and my silence. The perseverance piece is the one people underestimate. Holding that boundary after the angry phone call, listening to old grievances without defending myself, sitting on the porch alone more evenings than I'd like to count, wondering if I'd done the right thing and deciding again that I had. That kind of steadiness, the decision made not once but every single day, that's what actually transforms a situation. Not the dramatic moment, the quiet consistency afterward. I am 67 years old. I have a porch, a dogwood tree my late husband never got to see grow tall, a granddaughter who puts her head on my shoulder during old movies, and a daughter I am learning to know again on honest ground. That is not a small life. That is exactly the life I worked for. The notebook is still in my kitchen drawer. I don't need to open it anymore.